Joseph De Maistre is a relatively unknown name to us now, especially in the English-speaking world, but he was widely influential in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. A diplomat, writer, philosopher, his influence extended to the utopian socialists of France, to the counter-Enlightenment critics of the revolutionary spirit of Hobbesian liberalism and Jacobin radicalism. He was also lauded by the French poet Charles Baudelaire as the man who taught him how to think, and he was also a significant influence on the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy. Like many of the Romantics and counter-Enlightenment figures, Maistre was initially a soft supporter of the early French Revolution, a moderate reformer before the Revolution's Jacobin turn and the consummation of the Reign of Terror. After the Jacobin turn of the Revolution, Maistre, like many of the German Romantics, became a fierce critic of Jacobinism, liberalism, and the general revolutionary trends in political economy, i.e. early capitalism. He was also a critic of social politics and utopian dreaming. As the great historian of philosophy, Isaiah Berlin, noted, Maistre was certainly the most brilliant and polemical of the critics of the philosophy that lay behind the French Revolution. And this was Maistre's great polemical rhetoric and general brilliance. He took on the materialistic, mechanistic, Baconian Enlightenment philosophy on its own terms. That is, as Berlin stated, Maistre criticized the direct philosophy behind Enlightenment liberalism and Jacobinism. Most explicitly, Maistre argues that the mathematical optimism of materialism was pseudo-intellectual. It had no basis in reality. What he meant was also that numbers and math could not explain nature, as the mathematical philosophers were insisting, and that a reliance on numbers and mathematics certainly doesn't tell anyone anything about history. In fact, the mathematical optimism of Enlightenment science, which in turn was augmented into liberal politics by the likes of Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, was directly at odds with the basic insights one can derive from the empirical observation of nature. De Maistre charged, naturally, that man was not peaceful, as the Enlightenment philosophers had come to argue, and that there was no harmonious relationship with man and nature, and that nature itself has no harmonious relationship within itself. In doing so, Maistre hoped to expose the shallowness and pseudo-intellectuality of the French philosophers who cheered on the Revolution, even the Reign of Terror, as well as the hedonistic nihilism of the Baconian Hobbesian philosophical tradition that came out of England, which culminated in utilitarianism. De Maistre charges that the liberals study nature by imposing mathematics upon nature and impose their idea of harmony and goodness on nature and deduce from that presupposition and imposition something that already confirms a preconceived a priori belief. That is, Maistre is saying that the liberal study of nature already comes with a predetermined view that the study of nature automatically confirms no matter what nature and the study of nature actually reveals. Maistre charges that this anti-rationalism can only be countered by a true empiricism. The great irony of Enlightenment science is that it claims to be empirical, but is in fact a set of a priori rational beliefs. The Enlightenment philosophers and liberals come to the study of nature with the idea that 1, everything could be explained by mathematics, and 2, everything in nature is harmonious, 3, everything in nature is good. And because that is the set belief that they come to the study of nature with, everything they see, everything they study, must conform to that preconditioned belief. And that is exactly what we have, even though the study of nature often shows the exact opposite. Seeing through this facade is the task of the true promoter of the empirical sciences, that which Maistre thought himself engaged in. As Maistre explains, these people, these liberals, the Enlightenment philosophers, look at mathematics to confirm what is already in their own minds, but would be more useful, as he says, if they actually looked at history or zoology. What Maistre meant by charging that the scientists and Enlightenment philosophers should look at history or zoology instead of mathematics to confirm their a priori assumptions about nature, which they, through a rhetoric and an intellectual sleight of hand, claimed to be studying from the presumption of an a posteriori blank slate, was that the student of history or zoology gets a radically different picture of nature and humankind than what was being offered by the progressive and Enlightenment philosophers who supported the French Revolution and later the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. De Maistre writes, "In the whole vast domain of living nature, there reigns an open violence, a kind of prescriptive fury, which arms all the creatures to their common doom. As soon as you leave the inanimate kingdom, you find the decree of violent death inscribed on the very frontiers of life. You feel it already in the vegetable kingdom, from the great catalpa to the humblest herb, how many plants die and how many are killed. But from the moment you enter the animal kingdom, this law is suddenly in the most dreadful evidence. A power of violence at once hidden and palpable has in each species appointed a certain number of animals to devour the others. Thus there are insects of prey, reptiles of prey, birds of prey, fishes of prey, quadrupeds of prey. There is no instant of time when one creature is not being devoured by another. Over all these numerous races of animals, man is placed, and his destructive hand spares nothing that lives. He kills to obtain food, and he kills to clothe himself. He kills to adorn himself, he kills in order to attack, and he kills in order to defend himself. He kills to instruct himself, and he kills to amuse himself. He kills to kill. Proud and terrible king, man wants everything, and nothing resists him." Maistre argues, contrary to the optimistic mathematicians and the Jacobins, the Enlightenment liberals who argue that nature and human nature is benign, a simple study of nature and history reveals the exact opposite of everything that they were saying. As he says, "In the whole vast domain of living nature, there reigns an open violence." Against Rousseau, then, Maistre argues that there never was any harmonious state of nature to begin with, because nature itself, as he says in that luminous quote, is not harmonious with itself. It is a culling field of blood and violence, where animals plunder and wage war with one another. Ants terrorize and invade other insect colonies, tearing their insect rivals limb to limb. Fish eat one another, as in the famous words of Star Wars, "There's always a bigger fish." Even plants, like weeds, invade and destroy the roots of beautiful flowers and bushes, killing them so that they may thrive. But weeds, like man, thrives only by killing off what is next to him. Against Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the more mathematical and materialist liberals of the English and French Enlightenment, Maistre argues that their worship of mathematics and the Greek philosophy of harmony blinds them to history and nature, the reality of what it's like to live on Earth. Humans are not robotic masses of matter and motion, and neither is history the progressive push forward into enlightenment, progress, and liberty. Instead, humans are complex, irrational, unreasonable, and often fanatic beings. Here, Maistre would undoubtedly enjoy what modern science has uncovered with the brutal nature of chimpanzees and how chimpanzees wage war and tear one another limb from limb, just as much as ants and plants do, and humans do, in the civilized form called warfare. He would also cheer the discovery of the crushed skulls of Homo erectus, whose skulls were battered in by other primal humans for God only knows what reasons. So contrary, the new pseudo-intellectuals, the scientists, especially of the new atheist stripe, humans are not benign and compassionate beings, we are not rational creatures, and we have not been corrupted by the poisons of nationality or religions, for chimpanzees have no nationality and religion, and yet they are just as brutal as humans are. For Maistre, humans are by nature violent. They are by nature corrupt, or that is to say, they are wicked, they are dark, they are evil, they engage in killing, violence, and destruction. That is the actual nature of man, and frankly, that is also the reality of the natural world. Anyone who can study zoology would see the violence prescribed over the whole of nature. Anyone who comes to you offering an idea of a blank slate, the idea that humans are rational, the idea that humans were once good but have been corrupted by institutions or thoughts, have clearly never studied, in any meaningful sense, human history, human nature, or even the natural world, which reveal the horror of blood and violence. Likewise, Maistre targets the pretensions of the philosophy of progress. The tens of millions dead, displaced, and starving from the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars proved the shallowness of the compassion and humanitarian arguments from the Jacobins and other radical revolutionaries who claimed that by killing people they were helping others. No amount of blood was never not justified to reach utopia. However many need to be killed in order to reach perfection is the ultimate goal of the revolutionary. It is represented also by a brutal paternalism in politics that is far worse than the paternalism of the Ancien regime. For at least the Ancien regime wasn't promising progressive utopia in the name of its brutality like the revolutionaries do. De Maistre does not merely deal with the bloodshed of the French Revolution, which he described as unique in the history of mankind because it was, quote, radically bad, because it was the complete absence of any good, because it could not build but only destroy. He also criticizes the Enlightenment philosophy, as I've mentioned, of the tabula rasa, of the blank slate. In his sixth dialogue of the St. Petersburg dialogues, Maistre retorts through the count, "Liberty is the power to do. How is this? Has not the man who is in prison and laden with chains the power to make himself guilty of all crimes without acting? He has only to will, then. If then liberty is not the power to do, it can be only the power to will, but the power to will is the will itself." Maistre is arguing here, contra Locke, that our pursuit of knowledge and our pursuit of human life isn't based in rationalism, calculated study, and inference from observation. It is simply pure will. It is pure id. He goes on to counter, argues, Maistre does, that Locke has invalidated himself in his own arguments because, as Maistre knows, Locke really does believe in the will, and he does believe in a priori assumptions, such as human goodness and the natural law, which of course are a priori assumptions and not a posteriori empirical observations. As he says of Locke, Locke is perhaps the only author known who has taken the trouble to refute his whole book or to declare it useless from the beginning by telling us that all our ideas come from senses or from reflection, but who has ever denied that certain ideas come to us from the senses? What is it Locke wants to teach us? The number of simple perceptions being nothing compared to the innumerable combinations of thought, it remains clear from the first chapter of the second book that the immense majority of our ideas do not come from the senses. De Maistre sees Locke's blank slate as a regression in the history of epistemology, not because there is no progress in human knowledge. It is because empiricism of the kind that Locke promotes erodes common sense that has already been known to mankind from the beginning of time and from the deposits of our classical wisdom. Maistre's philosophy is attacking two key things, as one should be able to make clear now from his own writings that I've quoted. Maistre is attacking the revolutionary politics of the Enlightenment based on its false assumptions of human goodness, harmony with nature, and the belief that any corruption and badness that is found in man is the result of institutions or bad beliefs. De Maistre is arguing here that if one actually studies history, human nature, and the natural world, we would see the horror and terror of the violence that is inscribed in our very bones. He is also attacking at the same time the Enlightenment epistemologies of the tabula rasa and the blank slate. He is arguing, on the contrary, that these philosophers are hypocrites because they already believe in a priori assumptions, but they do not acknowledge it, and they lie about how they do not have assumptions coming to their study, and that through the study of nature, through the study of human actions, they are empirically coming up with the realities of human nature, when in fact a priori assumptions, the a priori assumption of violence, is in fact revealed through study, and thus there is not a division of the a priori and the a posteriori, as the empirical philosophers are claiming, but the two are in fact one and the same once you look at history, zoology, and human nature. Maistre is also, perhaps most importantly, within his critique of Enlightenment politics and philosophy, a critic of progress. The result of the philosophy of progress being promoted by the Enlightenment, tearing down all the barriers erected by humans and all the institutions established by humans meant to safeguard the dignity of life and liberty, only leads to violence. Progress in the Enlightenment was really the destruction of all institutions that resulted us in killing each other in a far more brutal and violent fashion than ever before. The end result of progress destroying everything that humans had erected to protect themselves ended up in the mass washing of human blood over the last 300 years. De Maistre would fundamentally agree with Nietzsche's statement that the collapse of morality into nihilism, always in the name of progress, would soak the earth with so much blood that humans wouldn't be able to recover when they awoke to the horrors of what they had done. Who will wipe this blood off us? With what water could we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we need to invent? With no guide, no divine guide or temporal guide, with no order, divine or human, Man is forever lost in the tragic abyss of violence and depravity and destruction. His pride, his insatiable lust to dominate, will ensure that all of our advances in technology are simply used to destroy, imprison, and tyrannize. De Maistre's philosophy argues something rather simple. It is not structures that are despotic and violent. It is the men who populate them that are despotic and violent, because man, by nature, is a violent animal. And thus, with the most utopian visions, the idea of progress, the idea of ending corruption, the violence of man is unleashed in the modern age in the name of progress, liberty, and equality. And this is what makes modern progressive philosophy so evil and wicked in Maistre's eyes. For De Maistre, progress and enlightenment philosophy is simply a veil hiding the violence of the revolutionaries who hate other men, who hate religion, who hate the rich, who also hate the poor even though they claim to like them, and simply seek to advance their own desires in the name of the idol of progress and liberty. History and zoology, according to De Maistre, confirm the bleak reality that man is not a rational and compassionate animal. Man is instead a bloodthirsty, violent, and in the language of theology, sinful, a sinful creature, a bloodthirsty, violent, and destructive creature, who lusts after domination and power and will do anything to achieve it, whether it's engaged in naked murder or the fanciful construction of language like liberty, progress, and equality to hide that lust to dominate others. De Maistre's philosophy is the philosophy of violence and destruction. It is also the philosophy of irrationality. It is arguing that all the claims of human rationality and harmony with nature are a fraud. When you look at nature, when you look at history, when you look at zoology, all you see is violence and the will to power.